Okay, so let's talk kids with special needs. Because here's the thing in middle school, not middle school, remember this is middle childhood, not middle school, so our 6 to 11-year-olds. This is the first time some of this stuff is going to show up. The struggles that kids have, the strengths that they have. Every parent of that 2, 3, 4-year-old thinks they're wonderful. Sometimes, yes, we are aware of struggles or difficulties or challenges, and we ask questions. But our kids are not getting the same kind of cognitive testing and not so many eyes on them to question things that might be more subtle. Things don't show up necessarily until these times too. So let's talk about a little bit about some of these. Developmental psychopathology looks at the difference between typical development and disorders. So how do these things show up? These can be difficult. This is the first time period, really. It can happen earlier for some things, but that we start to see kids getting diagnosed with stuff. And it's difficult to diagnose young kids with stuff because a lot of this comorbid may be part of it, presence of 2 or more unrelated disease conditions. I also think that things can mask each other. So there's a lot of misdiagnosis, especially in this time period and even through adolescence. There can be a lot of misdiagnosis of different disorders because they look the same, or there may be 2 things. And so if a child is both anxious and depressed, or bipolar, but maybe it's unipolar, there's maybe they're ADHD or maybe they're gifted. And so there's a lot of different, maybe they're dyslexic and it's showing up as acting out. I mean, there's a lot of different things that can play in. So we have to be really careful about making diagnoses too early with children. So several lessons. Abnormality is normal. Most people sometimes act oddly, especially children, especially 6 to 11-year-old children. And those with serious disabilities are like everyone else in many respects. So sometimes we miss things because they're subtle. Our internalizing children, if you'll remember from 2 to 6, will miss because they're good and they're quiet. Externalizing we can read it differently. I think I talked about that. It can be a lot of different things it's showing up as. We can peg something as antisocial when it has different roots, disability, and then kids are just weird. And I don't mean that, but I hope you're laughing with me, because sometimes they are. They're silly. They're trying out their senses of humor. Oh my goodness, the jokes my kid has told before. And, so we have to be careful. Disability changes. Things can grow. Kids grow more asynchronistically than synchronistically. They grow really fast in some areas sometimes and slower in other areas. So we have to be careful. So here's a big one, right? This is the big one for so much that we get diagnoses of, especially in this time period, the 6 to 11, ADD, ADHD. A condition in which a person is inattentive, impulsive, and overreactive, and thus has great difficulty concentrating for more than a few moments. Now, hyperactivity disorder, definitely. ADD doesn't have to have the hyperactivity, and so can show up. Our internalizing kids or our quiet kids or our introverts can be ADD in terms of having struggles focusing, but we may not see it as such because it's not externalized. Approximately 11% of children 4 to 17 years of age have been diagnosed with ADHD as of 2011. It's a lot of kids. 11% of our kids. More than 1 out of 10 of them. I mean, I just think that's a lot, and I think we have to question and wonder what's going on. The percentage of children with an ADHD diagnosis continues to increase, which just keeps getting greater. Rates of ADHD diagnosis increased on average of 3% per year. And then 5% per year. Boys were more likely than girls, and I'm going to say that's a lot because of more of the externalizing behaviors. We've seen now some articles about grown women with ADD that wasn't diagnosed or didn't show up or showed up differently because it wasn't as externalized. The average age of ADHD diagnosis is 7 years of age, but children reported by their parents when it was more externalizing types behavior, probably could be diagnosed earlier. When we get to school and teachers start saying, they're not able to sit still, they're impulsive, they're not able to focus, stay in their seat, all of these kinds of things. More U.S. children were receiving ADHD treatment in 2011 compared to 2007. Prevalence of ADHD diagnosis varies by state. Nevada being low, Kentucky being high. I don't know what that's about. How we judge the children, how we look at this, what we think needs to be done about it. So it's a big one in our culture, and so I'm sure a lot of you have different opinions on what you think about that in terms of, are we overdiagnosing ADHD? I definitely have seen where medication has been very, I think there need to be lines drawn. If a child is going to put themselves in danger due to their impulsivity, that's a real significant case. I had a friend with a son who I could tell when he wasn't on his medication, he wouldn't listen, and so actually was somewhat unsafe sometimes with his impulsivity. And I can see where we want to do something about that. Is a child acting out, impulsive for other reasons? Is it lack of emotional regulation for other reasons? Is medication the only way that we can deal with ADHD? So, questions to be asked and answered in time, hopefully. Bipolar, ADHD and bipolar and autism. Autism and bipolar are often misdiagnosed, which I do find to be interesting. A condition where the person has extreme mood swings not caused by outside experiences. Tends to run in families. Some research has suggested that people with certain genes are more likely to develop it. MRI study found that the brain's prefrontal cortex in adults with bipolar tends to be smaller and function less well compared to adults who don't have it. Now, there's different kinds of bipolar. Bipolar 1. Well, let's go back to that for a minute, though. So if we know that the prefrontal cortex helps in the inhibition of emotion and in emotional regulation, so what are we looking at with bipolar? It's definitely lack of integration within the mind in terms of handling different extremes of emotion. Bipolar 1, defined by manic or mixed episodes that last at least 7 days, or by manic symptoms that are so severe the person needs immediate hospital care. Typically, depressive episodes occur as well, lasting at least 2 weeks. Bipolar 2 is more depressive, defined by a pattern of depressive episodes and hypomanic, but no full-blown manic. So this is going to show up more in people who are depressed more. They might have, their mood may come up for a while, for a little bit, but it's not as up and down. And then there's quick cycling bipolar, where the cycles are really, really quick. And that's another one, and it can be very tough. I think this is a really tough one to diagnose in children this young. I mean, it can be very obvious maybe in some young children. But again, there's so many different things that can cause this. And because the brain is in such middle of development space between emotion and logic, and emotion and that inhibitory, again, always really good to be aware and to receive support in areas of deficit or challenge, and to always be really careful when it comes to full-blown diagnosis. Learning disabilities are another place that shows up with children when they get to school. Marked delay in a particular area. Now, you'll hear lots about dyslexia, unusual difficulty with reading. It's a processing problem. We don't hear much. The book doesn't even mention dysgraphia, but I wanted to mention it because it is real. A condition that causes trouble with written expression. Term comes from the Greek words dys and graphia, impaired, making letters by hand. I have a friend whose son is dysgraphic, and the child is profoundly gifted. He's way on that end of the IQ rhyme, except you couldn't be able to read his handwriting, and it looks like, a very young child tried to do it. And I say that just very seriously because it's difficult, and it's difficult if these children have struggle with this, or if a teacher sees this especially before any kind of real understanding of intellectual capacity is in play, they may think that the child is slow rather than that there's something wrong in terms of this ability towards the expression of language. And this can show up in many different ways. I have some links on dysgraphia if anybody's interested in that. Autism is another one that definitely is diagnosed in this time period. Developmental disorder marked by the inability to relate to other people normally, extreme self-absorption, inability to acquire normal speech. So we know that there's a spectrum, right? And I highly suggest the book Neurotribes if anybody is really interested in autism and the history of autism. Fascinating, really long, great audio though, if you like audiobooks. But it's fascinating, and it ties in, the history ties into some of our eugenics history, which is really tough, because we started out with autism. Two people discovered it at the same time, a man in America and a man in Austria. Asperger was in Europe, and oh goodness, now the man's name in America is going to escape me. But they weren't related. They didn't know anything about, we didn't have email back then, so they didn't know anything about each other's work. But they both named it autism at the same time. It was kind of interesting. But Asperger saw the kids that he recognized it in were more on he really recognized the capacities, the kind of ingenious capacities of some of these children. But then, yes, their struggles with, like they could get very focused on one thing and lack of deficits in social situations. But real genius in some areas where Connor, I'm sorry, that was his name, the guy in America. He really just noticed the children that struggled with language and really saw it more as sort of a deficit in learning and really more in the terms of this disorder aspect of this. And blamed it in the beginning, we blamed it on what he called refrigerator moms. That cold mothering was the reason. And it was his legacy that led us to a lot of our even modern ideas about autism as being something that needs to be eradicated. And this idea, and honestly, it's such a spectrum and it is such a challenge, and the lack of resources for some parents is astounding. And for those that are low on the spectrum in terms of functionality, language, physical capacity, mental capacity, it's, of course, we want to know what happened. We want to know what's wrong. There's been over 40 years of research and we still don't know. And yes, you can read things about it being diet, about it being vaccines, about it being genetic, about it being a whole host of things. The truth, we don't know completely. Yes, they are finding genes. They are finding, they're finding ties to these things. They're finding even things in gut, microbiomes, that the gut microbiomes are different in children with autism. Is it just food? There have been no continuing research that has shown that it's a particular diet. And if you read the history, autism's been around a lot longer than our processed food. A lot longer than vaccines. Some of our, early scientists and so forth meet a lot of the criteria we have today. Why is there an increase in diagnosis? Well, one theory around that is that over time we have expanded what it is to be autistic. It used to be very, very narrow. Very few people fit into the symptomology that we had for it, the criteria. The criteria have grown and widened. That's why it's a spectrum. And they did that on purpose to some degree, some researchers, in order to get more people resources for their children. And so I just find it a fascinating field. I am not an expert in it. I have read quite a bit on it, finding it fascinating, personally as well as professionally. And the one thing I would say that most autistic children share is the struggles and the deficits in social, no matter where they are on the spectrum. We no longer have Asperger's syndrome. That was taken out with the latest DSM-5. They took out that term Asperger's. And now it's just autistic spectrum disorder, ASD. And that would be high. What used to be Asperger's would be high on the spectrum, high functioning autism, we might call it. And most have deficits in social connection, meeting eye contact, and things like this. I have a nephew who was diagnosed at the age of 21, and this has been very, very difficult. And he is sort of an example of why diagnosis is so hard. He was diagnosed at the age of like 8 with severe social anxiety. Never did anyone mention autism, and that was back in the 90s at the time. So we were in a very different place with it. And he grew up in an area where it probably wasn't on the radar as much anyway. And so he has since then been diagnosed psychoaffective, bipolar, depression, so many personality disorders. And only now, finally, I think the one that's right, the base and core of a lot of it, and I think a lot of the others have been overlying diagnoses, functioning issues that have come potentially from default coping mechanisms that went awry. So, anxiety and depression in autistic children is going to be prevalent if it's not met and resourced and accepted and embraced. So there's been an argument between, in research, is autism something that's meant to be eradicated or something that's meant to be resourced? And we're moving more towards the resource and not the eradication, but the understanding and the embracing of what we call neurodiversity. That there's a lot of neurodiversity in the world. How do we begin to resource it? So here's one that the book talks a little bit about that I just wanted to add this to. This is actually for giftedness. And we don't think about it as being like, the giftedness began in the world as part of special education. If you look at that range of IQ things from up here, we're talking about anything kind of, especially 130 and above in IQ. And a lot of this has become, it's maybe an unfortunate term, gifted, because it has turned a lot of people off, made it sound elitist to people and so forth. The problem with this is that children that are, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 standard deviations, a standard deviation is 15 points. Sorry, I had a brief pause there, but children on this end that are maybe 2 or 3 or 4 standard deviations above the average are just as far from average as children 2 to 3 or 4 below. And they have some very specific issues sometimes in deficits that we don't actually know about. Overexcitabilities is one of them. That Dabrowski, a Polish psychiatrist, developed the theory of positive disintegration. What I'm going to say is that he came up with these 5 overexcitabilities that are witnessed more in gifted, not all gifted children have them, but witnessed more in gifted children. And it can cause a lot of fears, a lot of anxieties, a lot of perfectionism, a lot of social issues. The higher people go up in their intelligence, sometimes the worse these things are. And what's interesting is psychomotor overexcitability. Some of these can look like ADHD. Some of them can look like depression. Some of them can look like anxiety. So this is why we don't always know what it is we're looking at. This is a little bit of what was discovered I had to learn about with my child. So again, I just go back to that there's a lot of complexity in learning about our children, so many different layers and things that can be going on in terms of for any one child. And we just have to know, we just have to be aware of what we're looking at. So special education, whether a child is designated as needing special ed, is not straightforward. So how do we deal with this? Do we give them an IEP, an individual education plan? Do we have special education classes? Do we integrate them into the classroom? We're going to have different opinions and styles and so forth on all of that. Some integration is beautiful, and And then there's also something to the idea that I think in this period of life, especially 6 to 11, one of the most important things that a child needs is a tribe. And so however they're going to find their tribe is, I think, what's most important. Every child, no matter what their abilities or challenges are. If I had to give a question to middle childhood, like the question for adolescence, according to Piaget, is who am I? We're looking for who we are in our identity. I think the question for middle childhood is where do I fit? Where do I belong? And so special education, normal development, whatever we are and wherever our child is, finding them a tribe at this age is so very, very important. So I'll leave you with that, and we'll talk more about that later.